As far back as innovators of animation go, historians have discussed the likes of McKay, Blackton, Edison, Fischinger, Reiniger, Disney, and many more. However, another notable example would have to be Max Fleischer, as well as his many brothers, especially Dave. Alongside developing the technique of rotoscoping in the late 1910s to create fluid and lifelike animation, he also created machinery and processes such as the rotograph, which combined live action and animation, sound, which would be done in post using a cue meter, the stereooptical process, which was essentially a precursor to Disney's multiplane camera, and plenty of cartoon characters beloved by all, ranging from Coco the Clown, Betty Boop, Superman, and of course, Popeye the Sailor. Max's company, originally entitled Inkwell Studios before being changed to Fleischer Studios, lasted for about 21 years, progressing through technical advancements and cartoon magic, while also enchanting audiences throughout the Great Depression. However, he also happened to be Walt Disney's biggest rival around that time, not helped by Disney progressing with many of Max's techniques and his own star Mickey Mouse competing with Popeye at the box office. After the massive hit that was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Fleischers' distributor Paramount gave the studio a loan to make their own animated feature to capitalize on Disney's success. In response, Max chose to adapt one of his favorite books, Gulliver's Travels, into a movie, and the studio was willing to do so. The only catch was that Paramount gave them a production schedule of roughly 18 months in order to meet a Christmas 1939 deadline. As a result, the studio moved from Broadway, New York to Miami, Florida in 1938 in order to expand their studio, causing roughly 750 to 800 employees in total, some of which coming from West Coast studios like Disney and Warner Brothers. Despite the heavily rushed production, Max Fleischer's Gulliver's Travels was finally completed and released on Christmas 1939. Yet it wasn't very well received by critics, and there's a really good reason why. As stated before, Paramount essentially forced the Fleischer studio to make their feature in order to cash in on the success of Snow White. And it really shows. The entire movie basically feels like a soulless Disney wannabe, complete with the titular character being rotoscoped, several musical numbers, and the overly sentimental tone. What's interesting to note is that there were plans to make Popeye the star of the feature, and that would have made things much more entertaining, at least with Jack Mercer's humorous mutterings. The biggest problem with the film is the lack of momentum in its story, as the explorer Gulliver helps the small kingdom of Lilliput that declared war after an argument with the kingdom of Blefuscu, and that's basically it. There are some stakes that add a little suspense here and there, but the whole movie kind of feels like a short cartoon that was stretched to 76 minutes, not helped by how some scenes feel unnecessarily stretched out. In fact, after Gulliver washes ashore, he doesn't awaken until halfway through the movie. Come on, even Snow White didn't meet the dwarfs that long into the feature. Even the moments of tension are so underplayed and safe thanks to Gulliver that there's no point in getting any sense of excitement or intrigue into what's going on. In addition, the film also fails as an adaptation, as it only focuses on the first part of the original book with Gulliver getting washed ashore. And boy is this where things get boring. The general conflict comes from the Lilliputians and the Blefuscu natives declaring war over two different songs to play at the wedding of Princess Glory and Prince David, either Forever or Faithful. I haven't read the book, but I am well aware of its timeless and biting satire, and this is just weak, as it comes off as the typical political rulers wanting over the simplest of things. I would talk about the characters, but the only ones worth giving any credit to are the obnoxious town crier Gabby, King Little, and King Bombo, since they have way more personality than anyone else in the whole film. It is neat that the two kings really do love each other in spite of the war they declare, and Little is quite camp in his own regard. In addition, Gabby does sing a very optimistic song, All's Well, which I'm sure anyone could have fun listening to thanks to its happy-go-lucky tone, although his antics and high-pitched voice can get on some nerves. As for the rest, Gulliver has no character of his own outside of his goal to bring peace to both sides, and Princess Glory and Prince David are so bland and one-dimensional that even two pieces of paper are more complex than them. Seriously, they don't even speak until later on in the film, and we know nothing about them despite them being in love. Sure, Snow White wasn't very well developed either, but at least we understood that when she first saw the prince, she no longer felt lonely and wanted more out of her miserable life. Whereas Glory and David... I don't even have an inkling as to why they love each other, so... yeah. They're kaput! Now, to the film's credit, the animation is mostly very well done, with plenty of luscious backgrounds, colorful effects, and smooth character animation which really displays the animators really having fun with the characters they were animating. Even the rotoscoping done on Gulliver is very impressive. Yet, it's so impressive that it's unspectacular, meaning there's not a lot of pizzazz or stylization to his movements, making him feel more like a live-action character that just happens to be animated. Again, although Snow White was animated the same way, the Disney animators created her to move in a more lush, stylized fashion that helped her blend in well enough with the more lively dwarfs. The contrast between the hyper-realistic Gulliver and the cartoony Lilliputians, on the other hand, is jarring to watch, as they feel like they belong in completely different films. On the plus side, many of the songs are quite catchy, and they do highlight the upbeat musical tone that was very common in the 1930s. However, many of them sound more like copycat Disney songs with similar sounding singing performances and instrumentals. Even It's a Happy Day sounds way too similar to Whistle While You Work. Listen.
Just whistle while you work, and cheerfully together we can tidy up the place. So hum a merry tune. It won't take long when there's a song to help you set the pace.
Happy day, you and me, us and me, all the past has rolled away. It's a happy day, the sunshine bright, the roads all bright, it's a happy day.
Honestly, I think copycat is the best word to describe Gulliver's travels, as the movie comes across way too much like a Disney knockoff than a legitimately unique adaptation of Jonathan Swift's classical satirical novel. While the blame goes more to Paramount than the Fleischers, it still doesn't change the film from being nothing more than a bland and lackluster imitator of the very first animated Disney film. In spite of the critical reception, Gulliver was still a decent hit at the box office, earning roughly $300 million domestically. Unfortunately, Paramount withheld the Fleischer Studios to a $350,000 penalty for going over their original budget, causing further financial difficulties for the studio as they entered the 1940s. Fortunately, it was still enough to grant the studio another feature to make, but this time a more original and modern tale about bugs trying to survive in New York called Mr. Bug Goes to Town. Despite making something more unique, the film also had a rather infamous production, mainly due to a feud between Max and Dave which caused them to no longer speak to each other. Upon acknowledging the sibling rivalry, Paramount decided to structure their contract for Mr. Bug by allowing either brother to resign following the film's completion. Once the Fleischers' contract was renewed on May 24, 1941, the brothers were forced to sign letters of resignation to Paramount, leading Dave to fill out his resignation 1 month before the film's December 1941 release. But before I conclude this video with sadder news, allow me to share my thoughts on the film itself, because I personally find it an improvement over Gulliver. What makes the film unique is the way it tells its story, by putting a huge emphasis on world building in contrast to a town of insects living in a Manhattan corner and the much bigger scope of Manhattan itself. The bugs that live there have the misfortune of dealing with intrusive humans that drop cigarettes on them or cause all sorts of ruckus. In terms of main characters, there are two different sides who want to aid the insects, but one has a much more earnest and caring motive than the other. The protagonist Hoppity finds hope of a new garden home around the house of two humans, Mary and Dick, and he tries to move the bugs there to lead better lives, whereas the antagonist Sea Bagley Beetle desires the lowlands and Hoppity's sweetheart Honey all to himself, mainly given that he believes his wealthy status is more than enough to obtain such possession. This makes Hoppity very sympathetic, as he's more determined than ever to save his friends from certain doom. In addition, the humans Mary and Dick are also worth feeling sorry for, mainly because Dick is trying to write songs for Broadway to get his career off, and to keep his house in solitary confinement. It's later on in the film where we understand how any human losing a home is not so different from animals losing theirs, and given the status of my home state right now, I can totally relate. The animation is also very well crafted, as it manages to recreate a gorgeous-looking Manhattan with bright, albeit subtle lights and extravagant skyscrapers. Not to mention, it has a much better contrast between realistic and simplistic characters than Gulliver, with pseudo-realistic humans and exaggerated cartoony bugs, displaying the two different species in their own separate realities. However, the real highlight has to be the third act once the lowland corner is mounted, as shovels, water, and all sorts of construction material end up causing the bugs to risk their lives in order to save themselves from meeting their fates. Now, this is not to say that the film isn't without flaws, since most of the characters aren't particularly fleshed out. although Beetle's comedic sidekicks Swat the Fly and Smack the Mosquito do have their moments here and there. Also, despite there being some musical numbers, they don't leave much of an impact and feel more like an afterthought. Not to mention, given that this film was made in the 1940s, let's just say that some jokes are dated by today's standards.
Rice, boss. Jingo, hooka rice.
See what I mean? Nevertheless, I still recommend Mr. Bug for its intriguing story, lovable protagonist and antagonist, impressive animation, and its earnest intent to detail the daily struggles that some people suffer from in the real world, such as facing financial turmoil and house eviction. Hey, considering where I'm from, I think everyone has the right to live a free and well-mannered life, and thankfully, this movie respects its audience enough to give a lot of closure. God bless you. As for the release of Mr. Bug, it was not a pretty sight at all. While it did earn some critical praise, it had the misfortune of originally being released around the time of Pearl Harbor, causing it to flop tremendously at the box office. Even with the surprise hits of the Fleischer's Superman cartoons, it wasn't enough to save the studio from insolvency. By the time Mr. Bug was released, not only were both Fleischer brothers removed from their own studio and replaced by new management, but Paramount reorganized the studio into the Famous Studio, which lasted another 25 years, progressing with more Popeye and Superman cartoons, as well as their own series like Casper the Friendly Ghost, Little Lulu, Baby Huey, Herman and Catnip, Little Audrey, etc. So as you can tell, the later years of Max Fleischer's studio were rather disheartening when it came to the business side of things. Nevertheless, these failures should not detract from the efforts of Max Fleischer and his crew. Such imaginative innovation has rarely been matched, and it's not hard to see why even his biggest rival progressed with his old techniques. Even if their works tended to be hit or miss, if the two films I've mentioned aren't vital enough, the sheer fact that he and everyone else involved in his studio were able to put their creative ideas into practice after many trials and tribulations, whilst also succeeding at them, really shows how Max's hard work and dedication paid off in the long run. To this very day, Max's best work is still talked about and beloved by many, even in colleges, and it was all thanks to the Fleischers' chutzpah that helped challenge animation back then and even today.